Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. What is the future of democracy in the Arab Middle East? In the wake of the coup d'etat in Egypt, is this region condemned to a vicious cycle of uprisings and brutal suppression? What about the claim Islam and democracy are incompatible? And does the West really have an interest in seeing the people of the Middle East free to decide their own destinies? To CrossTalk the future of democracy in the Middle East, I'm joined by Stephen Bucci in Washington. He is director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Also in Washington, we have Gareth Porter. He's an investigative journalist and author of the upcoming book, Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of Iran's Nuclear Scare. And in Beirut, we cross to Naim Salam. He is a professor of international affairs and diplomacy. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Stephen, if I can go to you first. In the wake of the coup in Egypt, what is the future of democracy in the region?
I think democracy still has a great chance in the Middle East. Democracy and the transition to it does not happen overnight in anyone's country, and to think it was going to go without any hiccups in all of these different countries was a bit naive. So I'm very optimistic for the future.
But Stephen, it was unconstitutional. I mean, he was removed from power. We don't know what's going to happen to him. He hasn't been charged with a crime, but he's being held. I mean, this is a lot more complicated than it's just unfortunate this time around.
Well, I agree. And in Egypt, the jury is still out. We don't know where the military is going to take the new government and what the people in Egypt are going to do. So we're not quite ready to bless them and say everything is fine by any means, but the fact that they turned back Mr. Morsi's efforts that were moving away from democracy and the military sided with the people of Egypt does not necessarily mean that they're condemned to a cycle of violence and repression again.
Okay, Naim, if I can go to you in Beirut, but the United States is siding with the military. They continue to get their aid, at least so far.
Well, first on June 30th and July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, until July 7 and 8, the United States was hesitant to take a position on the coup d'etat in Egypt. Until yesterday, the spokeswoman of the State Department yesterday came forward and condemned the regime of former President Morsi, making clear indications that the United States is in support of the military coup and the new course of action in Egypt. It took about 10 days for the United States State Department and the White House to make up their mind on what kind of policies they're going to follow in Egypt. Finally, they settled on against the Islamic Brotherhood and in support of the new course of action in which the military will have the main say in the politics of Egypt in the coming months or years.
Gareth, can the military bring democracy to Egypt? Can militaries bring democracy to the Middle East?
Well, it's theoretically possible someplace at some time that might happen, but certainly that's not very likely in Egypt. And you can put me down as a skeptic with regard to the rhetoric of democracy and the Arab Spring with regard to U.S. and Western policy. The problem that I see is that has really been a cover for the exertion of U.S. Policy, the interests of U.S. policy in Egypt and elsewhere in the region. And in the case of Egypt, this is nowhere better illustrated than the term that I've been hearing in Washington the last few days, coup-volution. The idea that the effort to portray what happened in the Egyptian military's takeover as somehow a revolution rather than a coup d'etat. And the reality, of course, is that this is indeed the reassertion of the military's power and influence in Egyptian society, and their effort to guide that society in a direction that is going to preserve the military's interests, including its very large control over parts of the Egyptian economy. So, I mean, this is, to me, a perfect illustration of the problems that go along with presenting the politics in the Middle East in terms of some sort of march toward democracy. This is really, this is covering up the fundamental issues and problems that are primary in the region. And it's not just, the Egyptian military. It's elsewhere in the region. You have Sunni versus Shia as the primary problem, and Western interest in continuing to maintain their own influence in the region as a third.
Stephen, what do you think about that? Because we hear that there's support of the military, but there's support of civil society, in the democratic process, and there's a lot of contradictions there. Even people would say hypocrisy.
Well, I think, first of all, Garrett's points are absolutely right. It's a very, very complex, very convoluted situation. It is not particularly black and white.
Well, Stephen, why can't the Obama administration say coup?
Well,
why can't they just say coup? That's what it is. Why can't they just say it?
If you give me a chance, I'll explain it.
Please do.
The military sided with the people in throwing Mubarak out, and everybody applauded them for it. They got on the right side of history. This time they sided with the people, and they threw out Morsi, and everybody's upset, and I can understand that. The reason Obama's administration is reluctant to use the word coup is because we have laws on the books here in the United States that as soon as you say it's a coup, you have to cut off aid. And right now, as soon as they designated a coup, theoretically, we have to stop all aid. We, frankly, would lose all influence over the situation there, and I'm not sure that's necessarily wise. I would disagree with Gareth a little bit. I think he's given United States policies a lot more credit for their influence on the situation than we have. What the Egyptian people did has nothing to do with what the United States wanted or didn't want, and I'm not even sure we have that much influence with the military over the last few months since Mr. Morsi's been in power. Our influence there has waned a great deal. So while I agree it's very convoluted, I don't think the United States is calling the shots.
Okay, Gareth, jump in. This is CrossTalk. Go ahead.
Let me just respond to that very quickly. The problem is that the United States government, the Obama administration, really from the beginning was very clear that they were supporting what the Egyptian military was doing. Mm-hmm. They've been shucking and jiving ever since the beginning of this crisis. And as a good conservative, I would think that Steve would be saying, yes, it's time for this administration to follow the law, rather than to hide behind this falsehood that this was somehow something other than a coup d'etat. I mean, that's simply not an acceptable way for the United States to proceed, and it's really time for conservatives to get on board with the rule of law in this country rather than to support a democratic administration that is really not being honest with the American people.
Naeem, do you want to jump in and respond to what we've heard here? Go ahead.
Well, the United States could not overlook what has been taking place in Egypt over the past 11 days since June 30th. There were on June 30th in Egypt some 33 million people on the streets of various cities and towns all across Egypt. It is being said, and it is true, this is the biggest demonstration, popular demonstration probably in history. This large number of people coming out to speak against the regime of the Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. It took only 1 year for a majority of Egyptians to make up their mind and be against the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, primarily because the Islamic Brotherhood has used democracy to get took power. And once they were in power, they sought to hijack the government, the system in their own way, to their own ideology, to their own dogmas. And this really has scared of many Egyptians, including Sunni, Muslim, Christian, and otherwise. And the United States could not but take that into consideration in its new policy toward Egypt. The U.S. cannot take any negative position toward Egyptian military, because this will throw off the stability in Egypt for months and probably for years to come. And the U.S. cannot afford to see instability become rampant in Egypt first, and Egypt is the axis of the Arab world and the Middle East. This will cause a great deal of
Hold on. Let's
go ahead. Okay,
the Arab world.
Gareth, go ahead. Jump in. Because I mean, Egypt does play a very important role, and it should be some kind of model. Go ahead, Gareth.
But the idea that the Egyptian military's takeover of power in the wake of a democratically elected government is stabilizing the country simply doesn't pass the laugh test. And Paul Pillar, the former national intelligence officer of the United States for the Middle East and South Asia, just wrote the other day that the killing of dozens of demonstrators by the Egyptian military is a defining moment in the history of that country, the political history of Egypt. They have, in fact, taken a very fateful step. That's what's destabilizing Egypt, not the U.S., the possibility of the United States giving a truthful description of what happened and saying, you know, the law has been violated, we can't continue our aid to Egypt. Let's tell the truth here and not try to hide it.
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after a short break, we'll continue our discussion on democracy. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the future of democracy in the Middle East. Okay, Steve, I'd like to go back to you in Washington. I mean, how would other Islamic groups now see democracy in the region? Because they'll say, you know, these guys, they don't play by the rules. Why should we be part of this process? You know, this is a defining moment in that respect. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, just to respond to Gareth's earlier comment, I do agree with him. Absent a change in U.S. law, this was a coup d'etat. I think the president, they have to cut off aid unless Congress takes some steps to come up with an exception to deal with this, frankly, kind of nuanced situation, which Naim pointed out. It wasn't just the military who did this. There were 31 million people on the streets trying to change this system because they popped out of what was a true democracy and started moving in the wrong direction. You don't get a pass just because you've been elected to then do whatever you darn well please with the country. And I think the Egyptian people showed that that's not what they want to do.
Gareth, a pass? What about the rule of law?
But Steve, you know, you've got to...
Go ahead.
Yeah, the rule of law is still the single biggest problem here. And, you know, the Morsi government, whatever its faults, had not canceled democratic elections in Egypt. You know, the rhetoric of the United States has always been, well, you know, people who are dissatisfied with the situation should use the vote to make change. And that was still possible in Egypt. And to have the military take over and use force in this situation clearly is not the answer. It's not going to help. It was a huge mistake. It was a huge mistake to rely on force rather than to wait until the next election to unseat the Morsi government. That's what should have happened. And just let me add that, we have a situation in Egypt, as we do in Turkey and in Iran, where you have societies that are deeply divided between Islamic populations who feel strongly that the government should reflect their Islamic character, and people who believe that it should not, people who are essentially non-religious in their political views. And in that situation, it's much more important than it is otherwise to rely on the vote rather than to rely on violence and takeovers by street protesters to decide how to deal with this very, very difficult historical problem.
Naeem in Beirut, what about, will the Muslim Brotherhood be allowed back into politics? Should they be?
Let me point out first that more than 1 year ago, when the Muslim Brotherhood won the presidential election in Egypt with more than, slightly more than 50% of the vote, I said then that the Islamists will be their own very first enemies. They will shoot themselves in the foot sooner or later. Why? Because they will seek to monopolize the power and ideologize the society and the country. And it took only 1 year for a growing number of Egyptians to realize that and to turn against the Muslim Brotherhood. That's what had happened in Algeria in 1991-92 when the Islamic Salvation Front won the election, and then within a short time the military and the populace turned against them because they saw that
look what happened. 250,000 people died. Remember the results. Unfortunately, this is the byproduct of ideology and dogma. When ideologies seek to monopolize their own view and seek to implement it and apply it on the population without much diplomacy, without much give and take, as was happening, as we've seen with former President Morsi, this would be the final outcome or the expected consequences of that. Morsi did not, he spoke about negotiation and dialogue. Go ahead, Gareth, jump in. Go ahead.
Why not wait then until the next election to vote it out of office, if that's the case? And I agree with you that the Morsi government basically was not successful in winning the confidence of the population. But the whole point of this exercise was to wait until the next election. Why not do that?
Naeem?
Why not wait until the next election?
That's a good question, my friend. That's a very good question, and let me answer that. The reason is why I will not wait for the next election, because the actions and the acts of the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi himself were so inciting to the Egyptian people. For instance, in a town just outside Cairo, about 600 Christians were evicted from their houses, and 4 or 5 of them killed by the Muslim Brotherhood supporter based on religious reason. Another incident took place in which 4 or 5 Shiite worshippers were killed also in another town in central Egypt, and Morsi did not condone that, did not take strong reaction of that. So Egypt was really going into a conflagration of religious violence.
In the last 10 days, that continues to happen, okay? It continues to happen under the military rule right now.
Unfortunately,
and it was happening before as well.
It gotten worse.
It was.
Okay, Steve. I mean, if I could, let me go to Steve. Let me go to Steve in Washington. I mean, Muslims now may not participate in the democratic process in Egypt and across the region. That's worrisome, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I think you're trying to make this a monolithic grouping when you say Muslims. I think there's going to be a whale of a lot of Egyptians who will participate and will be a little more circumspect about voting for somebody like Mr. Morsi, who does have a lot of baggage, who does have a history of extremism. I hope, and I think all men and women of goodwill hope that Egypt moves to an election as quickly as possible, gets the military out of power, and puts it back in the hands of the civilians. But I think the Egyptian people, the year that Naim has referred to, have learned a lot about the process that one election does not a democracy make. You can have the election, but
well, there were a lot of elections, and the Brotherhood won every
rules.
single one of them. Okay. Gareth, what do you think about this? The future of
Steve, you know,
go ahead, jump in.
You know, the point I would add to what Steve has just said is that, you know, military coup does not democracy make either. You know,
I agree
that's
completely.
the fundamental point I think that we're looking at straight in the face right now.
Steve, you want to reply to that?
It's not going to help.
No, I agree completely. We're not thrilled that the military did this, but the military didn't just dream it up on their own and start it from scratch. They did it in response to millions of Egyptians in the street, as they did before when everybody thought it was a great idea. So we've got to make sure that we're consistent, and I agree with Gareth. The United States government must be consistent with its own laws and its own principles, but we as commentators need to be consistent too. That last time it was fine for the military to intervene on the side of the people, and this time when they did it, it's problematic. I'm not sure where it's going to go.
He went peacefully.
That we turn it over as quickly as possible.
Okay, Gareth, jump in.
Hold on. The reason for that, Steve, is that when the United States supported the popular protests against the Mubarak regime, it wasn't a democratically elected government.
Exactly.
I mean, it just wasn't, and that's a fairly big difference.
Naim, what do you think the future?
And by the way, the United States was very slow to support the popular uprising against Mubarak as well, just to make it clear.
Agreed.
Naim, what do you think of the future of Islamic parties in the region when it comes to elections now?
I think in the intermediate term and in the long run, the Islamic groups in the Arab world, whether in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, in Yemen, or in Syria, they are going backward and not forward because they are not on the right side of history. World development and the evolution of political system and history worldwide, whether it is in Europe, in the West in general, in the American continent, in Russia, everywhere, has been going in the direction of popular democracy and liberalism. Liberalism meaning where the government does not interfere in the private life of an individual and the people. What to eat, what to drink, when to fast, what not to fast, what to do, when to pray, when not to pray, etc. This will incite many people to be against such kind of orientation.
Okay,
liberalism
but that's exactly that's exactly what the military in Egypt is going to do, for the time being, anyway.
The military in Egypt is basically seen by the population as a savior. According to Google, there were 33 million people on the streets of Egypt on Google Earth on June 30th. And the military could not but listen to that, could not but take that into consideration. And it was this very reason that the United States and the West in general has played a low key in condemning or taking opposition role or to be against the military. That's why they stood.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here, Gareth.
For the first
30 seconds, going to give you the last word on the program. Go ahead, Gareth.
Well, I think the point that I want to make here is simply that the enemy of the kind of change that Naim is talking about and that clearly is going to be needed in the long run is anything that involves the use of force, which invites, of course, destabilization, violence, and frustrates precisely the kind of change that we all want.
All right, on that note, thank you very much, gentlemen. Many thanks today to my guests in Washington and in Beirut. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules. Please, it will not continue. Sorry to interrupt. I love you.
The new government and what the people in Egypt are going to do. So we're not quite ready to bless them and say everything is fine by any means, but the fact that they turned back Mr. Morsi's efforts that were moving away from democracy and the military sided with the people of Egypt does not necessarily mean that they're condemned to a cycle of violence and repression again.
Okay, Naeem, if I can go to you in Beirut, but the United States is siding with the military. They continue to get their aid, at least so far.
Well, first on June 30th and July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, until July 7 and 8, the United States was hesitant to take a position on the coup d'etat in Egypt. Until yesterday, the spokeswoman of the State Department yesterday came forward and condemned the regime of former President Morsi, making clear indications that they...
He is director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Also in Washington, we have Gareth Porter. He's an investigative journalist and author of the upcoming book, Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of Iran's Nuclear Scare. And in Beirut, we cross to Naeem Salem. He is a professor of international affairs and diplomacy. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Stephen, if I can go to you first. In the wake of the coup in Egypt, what is the future of democracy in the region?
I think democracy still has a great chance in the Middle East. Democracy and the transition to it does not happen overnight in anyone's country, and to think it was going to go without any hiccups in all of these different countries was a bit naive. So I'm very optimistic for the future.
But Stephen, it was, it was unconstitutional. I mean, he was removed from power. We don't know what's going to happen to him. He hasn't been charged with a crime, but he's being held. I mean, this is a lot more complicated than it's just unfortunate this time around.
Well, I agree. And in Egypt, the jury is still out. We don't know where the military is going to take.
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. What is the future of democracy in the Arab Middle East? In the wake of the coup d'etat in Egypt, is this region condemned to a vicious cycle of uprisings and brutal suppression? What about the claim Islam and democracy are incompatible? And does the West really have an interest in seeing the people of the Middle East free to decide their own destinies? To crosstalk the future of democracy in the Middle East, I'm joined by Stephen Bucci in Washington.